this episode of Curiosity's Sake actually ties into my review of the movie of this very video game, making this my first double feature. That's kinda sad. Anyway, I would like to hash out a few things before I get started. The first being that I was somewhat unsure as to whether or not the video game came before the movie. However, now I know that it was the other way around, that the movie was made 6 years before the video game. So yeah, sorry if I unwittingly misled anyone with my last video. I'm pretty sure I got it wrong several times, but it did get confusing due to me looking up both adaptations for a while. The other thing that I wanted to say is that due to the stories of this game and the movie being somewhat identical, I've opted to not really talk about the story of this game, since I pretty much covered it in the movie review. I'll only bring it up if there's any differences in this adaptation, but this is practically word for word the same story. I actually first discovered this game and the movie on Jim Sterling's Greenlight trailer series, where he watched the trailer for this game way back in 2014 and didn't seem all that impressed with it.
The Pilgrim's Progress. Ironically, a game that looks upon which very little progress has been made.
Admittedly, the trailer doesn't do this game many favours. In fact, it makes it look really bad because of the choppy frame rate, and even after playing this game, I look back on this trailer, and my impression of it is this game looks a complete mess. Jim also commented on this thing being incomplete, though it actually is quite solid as a gaming experience, and I never encountered anything buggy or broken during my playthrough, except for a minor checkpoint issue. Basically, at the final boss, they gave you a checkpoint in front of the boss to give you an advantage. However, I decided to leave the area to try and turn in some quests and get more XP, and when I re-entered the area afterwards, it reset the checkpoint to the start of the level instead of the end, which meant that I had to now defeat 3 generic enemies before the final boss, and if I died, I didn't get the buffs that you get on your first fight after dying, which would have helped a lot in the final battle, but now I can no longer get them because I'm an idiot. The game is very similar in style and tone to the movie, albeit improved, with the textures and the shadows being considerably better in this. The creature designs are also significantly better, but I feel like this is more attributed to the generic enemies. I feel like boss enemies that featured in the movie often took a step back as far as grandeur went, like Apollyon for example just being this big goblin fuck instead of this thing. There are some pretty cool designs for the enemies on display, like these muck monsters, these steampunk elephants, and a dozen of other creature designs that I found myself rather impressed with. I can't really think of a battle or a creature that I felt was underwhelming in its design. I also quite like the detail of the environments as well. They're a lot more bright and colourful than their movie counterparts and have a lot more thought put into them. You actually get to explore them in the video game adaptation, in some capacity, and the backgrounds themselves are actually quite eye-catching, as you can see in the backgrounds of these cutscenes. I also appreciate that they take full advantage of this by having certain elements and clues placed around the levels. Like, for example, there's a statue of Apollyon here at the beginning of the first level in the city, establishing his place in the world and also giving him some foreshadowing for his fight later on. I also expected the cutscenes to be MP4s of the movie, but they were actually stills with the whole story retold. As I said before, it's mostly the same, with a few minor variations. And one of those variations is Faith being a man, though the Adam the First plot is still cut from the game, and his dialogue is mostly the same. Hope on the other hand remains identical to his movie counterpart, as does Christian. This game also features a few mentioned-only characters in the movie, like Ignorance, though again they kind of leave out the whole him getting murdered for taking a ferry thing. A lot of characters have also had redesigns, but mostly they've remained the same at their core. Visually, I like the way that this game looks. It's quite stylized and unique. Everything has a lot of frames of animation with the intention of making it as fluid as possible, and I do appreciate that effort even if it does look a bit uncanny at times. The textures are pretty basic but nice to look at, and every environment achieves the effect that it initially wanted to give off. The soundtrack also gives aid to this, whether it's the bleak background tracks or the rockin' battle theme. I did like the battle theme at first, but given that it's the only one in the game, it loses its charm after a while, especially given that it restarts every time you fight an enemy. And sometimes you can fight 3 enemies in a row and it restarts every goddamn time. Some variation will be nice, at least for bosses, though I prefer it if every area's enemies got a different theme to break up the monotony. Persona 5 had a similar problem, but this game at least was smart enough not to include a song with lyrics in it, because that made it even more annoying. Although Persona 5 did have some variation in battle themes for some bosses, whereas this game does not have such a thing. Whilst I've been mostly positive up until now, it's far from perfect as a game. The biggest problem that I had was this game suffers from Getaway Black Monday syndrome. Like that game, it has no tutorialization whatsoever, and gives you a load of mechanics and such, expecting you to just deal with it. So you're given quests, but not told how to activate them, or deal with them in any way, and you just have to figure it out on your own. Every quest that isn't combat related involves you pressing the up key when approaching an NPC. The 2 most common quests are giving gold to poor people, or Bibles to cheapskates who don't want to buy one themselves. My favourite quest is in the Dungeon of Despair, where you have to talk 30 people out of suicide, mostly because you can't go over the limit of 30. So if you reach a situation where you meet suicidal number 31, then you can't help him because you've reached your quota as to how many suicidals you can help, so you just sort of have to shuffle past him and not make eye contact. How, Christian of you. The quests aren't the hardest thing to figure out. The real problem is during the combat. The combat in this game has a really interesting take on it, playing into the whole allegory thing. Every enemy is a form of problem that a Christian would have to face during the course of their life, and you would use the tools given to you by God in order to fix it. I really like this as an idea, and it plays out pretty well for the most part. It's a proper RPG with stats, powers, buffs, debuffs and everything else. I find it quite clever and intuitive, given that the player has everything that they need to beat the game from the start, and chooses as to which of the tools that they're given to improve upon and master. The issue really is that you can't really afford to neglect anything in this game, so I kind of ended up just adding 1 to every score point, you know, like you're not supposed to do in RPGs. It's not like you can have a rogue build though, in a turn-based combat game in which your ability to inflict and resist damage are instantly brought down to 0 by a debuff, and if you don't have any resistance to said debuffs, the debuffs destroy you in seconds. You need at least a steady amount of progress in all fields, or you're kind of fucked very early on. None of this is explained beyond a simple line of text that tells you what everything is, and even then, it doesn't exactly tell you how it works. For example, I didn't realise that the 5 resistances all had different effects, depending on the enemy that you're fighting. Faith, truth, promise and grace are circumstantial, while power slaps the enemy down and destroys their buffs. I didn't know this and just kept using power for a while, worried about fucking up my turn by using one of the others. This made it kind of difficult further in, when I encountered an enemy that required 1 of 4 other attacks in order to do some real damage. Creatures are weak to different kinds of attacks, you see, and your guess is as good as mine as to what those attacks might be. Sometimes I had to guess 4 times to find the right one, because the one that seemed the most obvious did fuck all. It would have been good to have something like the Pokédex to tell you what their weaknesses were, but sadly the best thing that you have in your arsenal is trial and error. Another thing that kind of baffled me is that there are 5 healing spells, and none of them are restore health. Instead, you actually have to pray for spirit. Okay. Not to mention that most of these things are redundant, as you can just use the blessings that can give you major boosts in power, mana, defense, and speed. And you can even drain an enemy's health. So, if you have this option, then it seems like a waste of a turn giving yourself a 10% strength boost when you can go for a 100% boost instead. Not to mention that unlike what this dumb asshole with the popcorn said, patience is hardly rewarded in the later battles, as they do this annoying debuff attack that stops you from attacking or defending yourself, and you lose the 50% power boost that you've been painstakingly working for the past 5 turns. Even if you do use the blessing that resists this, it will eventually run out and you're fucked again. It was at the boss battle of the Giant Despair that I was getting more than a little annoyed, as I had to do the same bit over and over again. Granted, I got to level myself up by doing this, but that didn't make it not a shitty thing to have to do for well over an hour. It's like purgatory. Then the final boss comes along and holy fuck, this thing's awful. I think I've dedicated around 2 to 3 hours trying to build myself up to beat this thing, and I actually gave up in the end due to it getting so boring and frustrating. So yeah, I technically didn't finish this thing, but I know the ending anyway as I watched the movie. It's somewhat rare that I don't see a game through to its end, you know, unless it's horrifically incompetent like Unknown City or boring as fuck like Poirot, but I could honestly make a whole video from start to finish in the amount of time it would take me to finish this one boss fight. And I'd much rather do that at this point than suffer from fucking sensory deprivation. I actually enjoyed this game for the most part, quite a bit actually. For all its flaws, you can tell that it was a passion project that offers something truly unique, and I can't help but respect that. Personally, I think this game deserves a place on Steam if it wants it, but I'd honestly say that it's too good for Steam at this point. It should probably look for a store with higher standards. Okay. Oops, I gave all my coins away.